on December 2nd, 1804, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Napoleon Bonaparte took the crown from the hands of Pope Pius VII and placed it on his own head. It was a symbolic gesture that announced to the world that this Corsican artillery officer had become Emperor of France. The crowd in Paris cheered. The soldiers saluted. The diplomats from across Europe bowed. But in the counting houses of London, Amsterdam, and Vienna, a different kind of calculation was being made. The bankers and merchants looked at their ledgers and realized that Napoleon wasn't just crowning himself emperor. He was declaring economic war on the entire continent. What followed was not just a story of military conquest. It was a story of how one man's ambition drained the treasuries of every nation in Europe, destroyed centuries of accumulated wealth, and left a trail of financial ruin that would take generations to repair. To understand the scale of the economic devastation Napoleon caused, you have to understand what Europe looked like before he arrived. In 1789, on the eve of the French Revolution, Europe was experiencing an age of prosperity. Trade was flourishing. The colonial empires of Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands were generating enormous wealth. Coffee from the Caribbean, spices from the East Indies, and cotton from America flowed through European ports. The merchants of Amsterdam, the bankers of London, and the manufacturers of Lyon were growing rich. There was a delicate balance of power maintained through diplomacy and occasional small wars, but nothing that threatened the fundamental economic order. Then the French Revolution exploded. The old regime was overthrown. The king was executed, and France descended into chaos. The revolutionary government, desperate for money to fund its wars against the European monarchies, did something radical. They seized the property of the Catholic Church, the largest landowner in France, and used it as collateral to issue a new currency called the assignat. At first, the assignat seemed like a brilliant solution. The government could print money backed by the value of the confiscated land. But the revolutionaries couldn't resist the temptation. They printed more and more assignats to pay for the armies, to subsidize bread, and to buy loyalty. By 1796, it took 7,000 assignats to buy what one assignat had bought in 1790. The French currency had collapsed into worthless paper. The French economy was in ruins. Shops were empty. Workers were starving. The revolution had created political freedom, but economic catastrophe. This was the France that Napoleon inherited when he seized power in a coup in November 1799. He became first consul, effectively a dictator, and his first priority was to restore financial order. Napoleon understood that power without money was an illusion. He moved quickly. In 1800, he created the Bank of France, a central institution that would control the money supply. He stabilized the currency by introducing the franc germinal, a new coin backed by gold and silver. He reformed the tax system, making it more efficient and less corrupt. Within 2 years, Napoleon had pulled France back from the edge of economic collapse. The shops were stocked again. The bread lines disappeared. The middle class began to trust the currency. It was an impressive achievement, but Napoleon wasn't satisfied with just being the administrator of a stable France. He had tasted glory on the battlefield in Italy and Egypt. He had seen the paintings of ancient Roman emperors in the galleries of the Louvre. He wanted more than stability. He wanted empire, and empire costs money. Enormous amounts of money. Napoleon's military machine was the most expensive institution in Europe. He commanded an army of over 500,000 men, the largest standing army the continent had seen since the fall of Rome. These men had to be fed, clothed, armed, and paid. They needed boots, muskets, gunpowder, and horses. They needed surgeons, supply wagons, and engineers. The logistical complexity was staggering. And unlike the old aristocratic armies, where soldiers fought for honor or were pressed into service, Napoleon's Grande Armée expected to be paid. Napoleon had made a promise to his soldiers: "Follow me, and you will be rewarded." He created the Legion of Honor, a meritocracy where a common soldier could rise to become a marshal and a duke if he proved himself in battle. But titles weren't enough. Napoleon paid his soldiers regularly and well. A French infantryman earned more than his Austrian or Prussian counterpart. The marshals became fabulously wealthy, living in palaces and commanding estates. Where did this money come from? At first, Napoleon tried to fund the army through taxes on France, but even with the improved tax system, the French economy couldn't generate enough revenue to support such a massive military. The population of France was about 30 million. The population of his enemies, Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, combined was over 100 million. Napoleon was outnumbered economically as well as militarily, so he came up with a different funding model. He would make war pay for war. He would conquer other countries and force them to pay for the French army. It was a strategy of military looting elevated to the level of state policy. The mechanism worked like this. When Napoleon's armies defeated an enemy, they didn't just occupy the territory. They imposed a massive indemnity, a financial penalty that the defeated nation had to pay to France. In addition, the French army would requisition supplies directly from the local population, taking food, horses, and equipment without payment or at vastly deflated prices. It was systematic plunder disguised as military necessity. The first victim was Austria. In 1805, after Napoleon crushed the combined Austrian and Russian armies at the Battle of Austerlitz, he imposed the Treaty of Pressburg on the Austrians. Austria was forced to pay 40 million francs in war indemnities. They also had to give up vast territories in Italy and southern Germany. These territories weren't just land, they were sources of tax revenue. Napoleon was stripping Austria of its ability to raise money in the future. The Austrian treasury was devastated. To pay the indemnity, the Habsburg government had to borrow heavily, issuing bonds at punishing interest rates. The Austrian currency, already weakened by years of war, began to lose value. The cost of food and basic goods rose. The Austrian people, who had not asked for this war, were now paying for their emperor's defeat. But Austria was just the beginning. In 1806, Napoleon dismantled the Holy Roman Empire, the ancient patchwork of German states that had existed for 1,000 years. He reorganized the German territories into the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of puppet states under French control. Each of these states was forced to contribute troops and money to the French war machine. Bavaria, Württemberg, and Saxony had to maintain armies, not for their own defense, but to be rented out to Napoleon. The princes of these states were promoted to kings, given fancy titles, and told they were partners in the French Empire. But in reality, they were vassals paying tribute. Then came Prussia. In 1806, the Prussian army, proud heir to the military traditions of Frederick the Great, marched against Napoleon. It was a disaster. At the twin battles of Vienna and Auerstedt, Napoleon destroyed the Prussian military in a single afternoon. The legendary Prussian discipline collapsed in the face of French artillery and cavalry charges. Napoleon entered Berlin in triumph. The humiliation for Prussia was total. But worse was the financial penalty. The Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 forced Prussia to pay 120 million francs in reparations. Prussia also had to reduce its army to 42,000 men and cede half its territory to new French satellite states. To pay the indemnity, the Prussian government sold off crown lands, borrowed from foreign banks, and imposed emergency taxes. The Prussian economy, which had been one of the most efficient in Europe, was crippled. The middle class saw their savings evaporate. The peasants, already struggling, faced higher taxes. The financial strain created social unrest that would simmer for decades. Meanwhile, Napoleon turned his attention to a different kind of economic warfare. He couldn't defeat Britain militarily. The Royal Navy controlled the seas. The French fleet had been destroyed at Trafalgar in 1805, so Napoleon devised a plan to strangle Britain economically. In 1806, he issued the Berlin Decree, the foundation of what became known as the Continental System. The decree forbade any country in Europe from trading with Britain. No British goods could enter European ports. No European goods could be exported to Britain. Napoleon believed that Britain, dependent on its trade and industry, would collapse if it was cut off from its markets. He thought he could bankrupt the British by denying them customers. The Continental System was the most ambitious economic blockade ever attempted. It covered virtually the entire European coastline from Spain to Russia. But it was also a catastrophic miscalculation that would destroy Napoleon himself. The immediate effect of the blockade was chaos in the European economy. British goods, textiles, iron tools, colonial products like sugar and coffee had flooded European markets for decades. Suddenly, they were illegal. The price of coffee tripled. The price of sugar quintupled. In Paris, the price of a simple cotton shirt doubled because British cotton mills were the most efficient in the world. French and German manufacturers couldn't match the quality or the price. European consumers were forced to buy expensive, inferior substitutes or do without. The merchants who had built their businesses on British trade were ruined overnight. In the ports of Hamburg, Amsterdam, and Marseille, warehouses sat full of goods that couldn't be sold. Ships rotted at anchor. Thousands of dock workers, sailors, and traders lost their livelihoods. The blockade also hurt the regions that Napoleon controlled. The economies of Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands depended on maritime trade. Cutting off trade with Britain meant cutting off their prosperity. The people in these occupied territories began to hate the French, not just for the military occupation, but for the economic strangulation. But the people found a way around the system. Smuggling exploded. The coast of Europe became a vast network of illegal trade routes. British goods were landed secretly on beaches in the middle of the night. They were hidden in false-bottomed wagons and smuggled across borders. Corrupt officials looked the other way for a bribe. Napoleon sent customs agents and soldiers to enforce the blockade, but it was impossible. The coastline was too long. The profit from smuggling was too high. Napoleon realized that the continental system was failing, but he couldn't admit it. To do so would be to admit weakness. Instead, he doubled down. He became obsessed with closing every loophole, every gap in the blockade, and this obsession led him to make the decisions that would ultimately destroy him. In 1807, Portugal refused to join the Continental System. Portugal was an old ally of Britain, and its economy depended on trade with the British Empire. Napoleon demanded that Portugal close its ports to British ships. When the Portuguese refused, Napoleon sent an army through Spain to invade. The invasion of Portugal seemed like a minor campaign, but it opened a wound that would never heal. The Spanish people, humiliated by the presence of French troops on their soil, rose in revolt in 1808. Napoleon decided to crush the uprising by force and to replace the Spanish king with his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte. The Spanish War, which the British called the Peninsular War, became a bleeding ulcer for the French Empire. For 6 years, from 1808 to 1814, Napoleon kept 300,000 troops in Spain, trying to pacify a population that refused to submit. The Spanish resistance invented a new form of warfare. They called it guerrilla war, little war. Small bands of fighters would ambush French supply columns, assassinate French officers, and then disappear into the mountains. The French couldn't defeat an enemy they couldn't find. The financial cost was staggering. Keeping 300,000 men in Spain cost over 100 million francs a year. That money could have been used to build roads, schools, and hospitals in France. Instead, it was being poured into a war with no end. The soldiers sent to Spain were lost to Napoleon's other campaigns. When he later needed them to fight in Russia and Germany, they weren't available. They were pinned down in the hills of Aragon, chasing ghosts, and the Spanish weren't paying for the occupation. Unlike Austria or Prussia, Spain couldn't be made to pay in debt. The country was too poor and too hostile. The French army in Spain had to be supplied from France, draining the French treasury. For the first time, Napoleon's model of making war pay for war had failed. At the same time, the Continental System was driving Napoleon toward an even greater catastrophe. In 1810, Russia began to ignore the blockade. The Russian economy depended on exporting grain, timber, and other raw materials to Britain. The Russian nobility, whose estates produced these goods, were losing fortunes because of the blockade. Cesar Alexander, under pressure from his own aristocracy, quietly allowed trade with Britain to resume through neutral ships. Napoleon was furious. He saw this as a betrayal. The Continental System, his grand strategy to defeat Britain, only worked if every nation obeyed. If Russia broke the blockade, the whole structure would collapse. Napoleon decided that he had to invade Russia to enforce the economic blockade. It was a decision driven by financial logic, not military necessity. Russia wasn't threatening France, but Napoleon believed that if he allowed Russia to defy him, the entire continental system would unravel, and his empire would lose its economic weapon. In June 1812, Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men, drawn from France, Germany, Italy, and Poland, crossed the Niemen River into Russia. It was the greatest military gamble in history, but it was also the greatest financial gamble. Feeding and supplying 600,000 men in the vast emptiness of Russia was an impossible logistical challenge. Napoleon expected to win a quick victory, impose a treaty on the Tsar, and force Russia back into the continental system. He expected the war to pay for itself through Russian reparations. Instead, the campaign turned into a nightmare. The Russians retreated, burning their own crops and villages as they went. There was nothing for the French army to plunder. The soldiers began to starve. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow in September, he found the city deserted and burning. There were no supplies, no food, no indemnity. The Tsar refused to negotiate. Napoleon had marched 600,000 men into a trap. When the retreat began in October, the Grande Armée disintegrated. Men froze, starved, and were hunted by Russian cavalry. Of the 600,000 men who entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 made it back. Napoleon had lost the core of his army, and he had gained nothing. The financial consequences were immediate. Napoleon tried to rebuild the army, conscripting teenagers and recalling veterans, but raising a new army of 400,000 men in 1813 required money that France didn't have. Napoleon had to print money, issue bonds, and squeeze every possible franc from the French tax system. Inflation began to creep back. The French people, who had tolerated the wars as long as they brought glory and plunder, now began to see only the costs. The young men were being taken. The taxes were rising, and the empire was shrinking. In 1813, Napoleon's German allies abandoned him. The princes who had once pledged loyalty to France now joined the coalition against him. They had grown tired of paying tribute. They had grown tired of sending their sons to die in French wars. At the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, Napoleon was defeated by a combined army of Austrians, Prussians, Russians, and Swedes. It was the largest battle in history before World War I, and Napoleon lost. The German states defected. The Confederation of the Rhine collapsed. Napoleon's empire, built on military conquests and financial extraction, fell apart the moment the conquests stopped. By early 1814, the Allied armies were marching on Paris. Napoleon's treasury was empty. He couldn't pay his soldiers. He couldn't buy gunpowder. The Bank of France, which he had created to stabilize the currency, was on the brink of collapse. Napoleon abdicated in April 1814 and was exiled to the island of Elba. The empire was over. But the economic damage Napoleon had inflicted on Europe was just beginning to be understood. France was exhausted. The wars had drained the country of men and money. The economy, which had been stable in 1804, was now fragile. The government debt had exploded. The infrastructure, the roads, the canals, had been neglected for 15 years, while all resources went to the military. But France was not the worst off. The countries that Napoleon had conquered were in ruins. Austria had been forced to pay indemnities 3 times. Its currency was nearly worthless. The Austrian government had issued so much paper money to pay for the wars that it took 10 paper florins to equal the value of 1 silver florin. The middle class, which had invested in government bonds, was wiped out. Prussia was bankrupt. The reparations imposed by Napoleon, combined with the costs of rebuilding the army, had drained the treasury. The Prussian government would spend the next 20 years struggling to pay off the debts incurred during the Napoleonic Wars. Spain was devastated. The Peninsular War had destroyed the Spanish economy. The country had been a battlefield for 6 years. Farmland had been ruined. Cities had been sacked. The Spanish government was so broke that it couldn't even pay its own soldiers. The chaos in Spain contributed to the loss of its South American colonies, which declared independence while the Spanish government was distracted by the war in Europe. The Netherlands, which Napoleon had incorporated into France, had seen its trade destroyed by the Continental System. Amsterdam, once the financial capital of Europe, was a shadow of its former self. The Dutch East India Company, which had once dominated global trade, was defunct. Italy was a patchwork of ruined states. The northern regions had been turned into French satellites and drained of resources. The constant warfare had destroyed the Italian economy, which had been flourishing during the Renaissance. Even Russia, which had ultimately defeated Napoleon, was financially exhausted. The war had cost the Russian treasury over 200 million rubles. The country's infrastructure had been damaged, and the population had suffered immensely. The only country that emerged from the Napoleonic Wars in a stronger financial position was Britain. While the rest of Europe was bankrupted by war, Britain's economy had actually grown. Protected by the Royal Navy, British trade continued. British industry expanded to fill the gap left by the Continental System. By 1815, Britain was the undisputed economic superpower of Europe. London replaced Amsterdam as the financial capital of the world. The pound sterling became the global reserve currency. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 tried to restore order to Europe. The diplomats redrew the map. Creating a balance of power meant to prevent another Napoleon, but they couldn't redraw the economic map. The wealth that had been destroyed couldn't be restored by treaty. The merchants who had been ruined couldn't be made whole. The soldiers who had died couldn't be brought back to work in the fields and factories. The Napoleonic Wars had consumed the accumulated wealth of a generation. The cost of Napoleon's ambition can be measured in many ways. Historians estimate that between 3 and 6 million people died in the Napoleonic Wars. That's a catastrophic human cost. But the economic cost was just as devastating. The wars cost the European powers an estimated 3 billion francs in direct military spending. That's equivalent to hundreds of billions in today's money. But the indirect costs were far higher. The trade that was lost, the investments that were destroyed, the businesses that failed, the productivity that vanished when millions of men were taken from farms and factories to fight. Some economists estimate that the Napoleonic Wars set European economic development back by 20 years. The ultimate irony of Napoleon's empire is that it was built on sand. He conquered to extract wealth, but the conquests cost more than they generated. He imposed the Continental System to defeat Britain, but it impoverished his own empire. He invaded Russia to enforce an economic blockade, and the invasion destroyed his army. Napoleon was a military genius, but he was an economic illiterate. He understood tactics and strategy. He understood how to inspire men and win battles. But he never understood that an empire cannot be sustained by plunder. Wealth has to be created, not just taken. The factories, the farms, the workshops that create prosperity need peace, stability, and trade. Napoleon gave Europe war, chaos, and blockades. And in the end, the economic contradictions of his empire brought it crashing down. The Europe that emerged from the Napoleonic Wars was poorer, more divided, and more traumatized. The middle classes who had been ruined would spend decades recovering. The governments that had been bankrupted would struggle with debt for generations. The trust in paper money had been shattered. It would take years to restore. Napoleon died in exile on the island of St. Helena in 1821. By then, Europe was trying to forget him. The empires he had toppled were restored. The kings he had deposed were back on their thrones. But the financial scars he had inflicted remained. The lesson of Napoleon's empire is clear. Military power without economic sustainability is a fantasy. An empire built on conquest and extraction will always collapse. Because in the end, you cannot shoot your way to prosperity. You cannot loot your way to greatness. And you cannot force people to be prosperous at the point of a bayonet. Napoleon conquered Europe, but he bankrupted it. And in bankrupting Europe, he bankrupted himself. I'm Adam, and this is the Prime History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it.